The moon hung low over Black Tide Cove, its silver light spilling across the restless waves like liquid starlight. The air was thick with the scent of salt and the faint tang of rum, mingling with the distant cries of gulls. In the shadow of the docks, Captain Raylan Graves sat alone, his broad shoulders hunched over a chipped wooden table. His dark, wind-tousled hair framed a face weathered by years at sea, and his piercing green eyes, like storm-tossed waters, held a depth of sorrow no bottle could drown. Ryland's ship, the Ebon Marauder, lay anchored in the harbor, its black sails furled and its hull scarred from countless battles. Once it had been his pride, a symbol of his freedom. Now it felt like a tomb, a reminder of the crew he had lost to the jaws of the Kraken. He raised a battered flask to his lips, the rum burning his throat, but doing little to numb the ache in his chest. As the night deepened, a melody drifted through the air, soft and haunting, like the whisper of the tide against the shore. It was a song that seemed to call to him, weaving through the noise of the tavern and the crash of the waves. Ryland's head snapped up, his heart pounding in a rhythm he hadn't felt in years. He rose unsteadily, following the sound as if pulled by an invisible thread. The song led him to a secluded cove, where the moonlight danced on the water like scattered diamonds. There, perched on a jagged rock, was a figure that stole his breath. Seraphine, the mermaid, was unlike anything he had ever seen. Her skin glowed with an otherworldly luminescence, and her long, flowing hair shimmered like the midnight sea. Her eyes, a deep, mesmerizing blue, held the mysteries of the ocean itself. Scales of iridescent azure adorned her tail, catching the light and casting rainbows across the sand. For a moment, Ryland could only stare, his voice caught in his throat. Then, as if compelled by some force greater than himself, he stepped forward. "You look pretty today," he said, his voice rough but sincere. The words felt inadequate, but they carried a weight he couldn't explain. Seraphine tilted her head, her lips curving into a smile that was both playful and knowing. "Pretty," she echoed, her voice like the gentle lapping of waves. "You speak as though beauty is a simple thing, Captain, but the sea is never simple, and neither am I." Ryland felt a flush rise to his cheeks, though he couldn't say why. "I meant no offense," he said gruffly. "It's just, I've never seen anything like you." Seraphine's laughter was a melody that sent shivers down his spine. "And I have never seen a man who speaks so plainly yet hides so much," she replied. Her gaze softened, and she extended a hand, her fingers delicate but strong. "If you seek more than fleeting words, Ryland Graves, prove your worth. The trials of the abyss await those who dare to love what the sea holds dear." Ryland hesitated, his mind racing. He had spent years running from his past, from the guilt and the pain. But something in Seraphine's eyes called to him, a promise of redemption, of something greater than himself. "What must I do?" he asked, his voice steady despite the storm raging within him. Seraphine's smile deepened, and she leaned closer, her breath warm against his skin. "Follow me," she said, her voice a whisper that stirred something deep in his soul. "And perhaps in the depths you will find what you have been searching for." Without another word, she slipped into the water, her tail cutting through the waves with effortless grace. Ryland watched her go, his heart pounding in his chest. He knew this was madness, that no sane man would follow a mermaid into the unknown. But as the melody of her song filled the air once more, he felt something he hadn't felt in years. Hope. With a deep breath, Ryland stepped into the water, the cool embrace of the sea wrapping around him like a promise. The trials of the abyss awaited, and though he didn't know what lay ahead, he knew one thing for certain. His life would never be the same. The sea was a living thing, its currents pulling Ryland deeper into its embrace as he followed Seraphine through the sapphire depths. The water was colder here, darker, but it carried a strange warmth whenever her tail brushed against him, leaving trails of shimmering light in her wake. Her scales glowed faintly, casting an ethereal glow that illuminated the path ahead. Ryland's lungs burned, but he pushed the discomfort aside, focusing on the rhythm of her movements, the way her hair flowed like seaweed in the current. They descended into the sapphire trench, a place where the ocean seemed to hold its breath. The pressure grew heavier, the light dimmer, until they reached a cavern that pulsed with a soft, blue radiance. Seraphine turned to him, her eyes glowing like twin moons in the darkness. "The first trial," she said, her voice echoing in his mind rather than his ears, "is courage. You must face the luminous Leviathan and retrieve his pearl." Before Ryland could respond, the water around them stirred, and a low, resonant hum filled the trench. From the shadows emerged the Leviathan, a creature of unimaginable beauty and terror. Its body was translucent, its veins glowing with the golden light that pulsed in time with the cavern's rhythm. Its eyes, vast and ancient, locked onto Ryland, and he felt the weight of centuries in its gaze. Seraphine handed him a harpoon, its tip forged from one of her own scales. "This will guide you," she said, her voice soft but firm. "But remember, courage is not the absence of fear. It is the choice to move forward despite it." Ryland gripped the harpoon, his heart pounding. He had faced storms, battles, and the wrath of the Kraken, but this was different. This was a test of something deeper, something he wasn't sure if he still possessed. With a deep breath, he swam toward the Leviathan, the water parting before him as if in reverence. The creature watched him approach, its massive form undulating gently. Ryland hesitated, his mind racing, but then he thought of Seraphine, of the way her laughter had stirred something in him he thought long dead. He thought of the trials, of the chance to prove himself, not just to her, but to himself. With a sudden burst of speed, the Leviathan surged forward, its jaws opening wide. Ryland dodged, his movements clumsy compared to the creature's grace. He struck with the harpoon, the enchanted tip piercing the Leviathan's side. It roared, a sound that reverberated through the water and shook Ryland to his core. But he held on, his grip tightening as the creature thrashed. Finally, with a mighty heave, Ryland plunged the harpoon into the Leviathan's chest, just below its glowing heart. The creature stilled, its eyes softening as it released a single luminous pearl. Ryland caught it, the warmth of the pearl spreading through his hand and into his chest. The Leviathan's body began to dissolve, its light scattering like stars in the water. Ryland turned to Seraphine, who swam to his side, her eyes filled with something he couldn't quite name. "You did it," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. Ryland held out the pearl, but Seraphine shook her head. "Keep it," she said. "It is a piece of the Leviathan's soul, a reminder of your courage." As they ascended from the trench, Ryland felt a change within him. The weight of his past seemed lighter, as if the Leviathan's light had burned away some of the darkness. Seraphine swam beside him, her presence a constant, comforting force. When they reached the surface, the moon hung high above, its light reflecting in Seraphine's eyes. She turned to him, her expression soft but unreadable. "The trials are not just tests," she said quietly. "They are journeys, and sometimes the greatest challenge is not the trial itself, but what it reveals within us." Ryland nodded, his gaze lingering on her. He didn't know what the next trial would bring, but for the first time in years, he felt ready to face it. The sea was restless, its waves churning like a beast stirred from slumber. Ryland stood at the helm of a small, borrowed skiff, his eyes scanning the horizon. Seraphine swam alongside, her azure scales catching the sunlight and scattering it like shards of glass. The air between them was charged, a silent understanding that words could not capture. They had survived the first trial, but the second loomed ahead, a shadow on the edge of their thoughts. Their destination was the Coral Citadel, an ancient fortress hidden beneath the waves. It was said to hold the second trial, a test of trust. But as they approached, the water grew unnaturally still, the silence heavy with foreboding. "Something is wrong," Seraphine murmured, her voice barely audible over the lapping waves. Her eyes, usually so calm, flickered with unease. Before Ryland could respond, the skiff shuddered violently. From the depths rose a massive ship, its hull black as midnight and its sails tattered like the wings of a fallen angel. The Crimson Cutlass, captained by Morgrath, a pirate whose name was whispered in fear across the seas. Morgrath stood at the bow, his figure silhouetted against the sun. His face was scarred, his eyes cold and calculating. "Well, well," he drawled, his voice dripping with mockery. "The captain of the Lost Ties and his little fish. How quaint." Ryland's hand instinctively went to the hilt of his cutlass, but Morgrat's crew was already moving, their nets and harpoons aimed at Seraphine. She dove beneath the waves, but the nets were enchanted, their threads glowing with a sinister light. "Run!" Ryland shouted, but it was too late. The nets closed around Seraphine, their magic binding her in a cage of light. She thrashed, her tail sending sprays of water into the air, but the more she struggled, the tighter the nets became. Morgrath laughed, a sound that sent a chill down Ryland's spine. "You thought you could keep her to yourself, Graves? The sea belongs to those who are strong enough to take it." Ryland's heart pounded as he leaped onto the crimson cutlass, his cutlass flashing in the sunlight. He fought with a ferocity born of desperation, his movements fueled by the memory of Seraphine's laughter, the way her eyes had softened when she looked at him. But Morgrat's crew was relentless, their numbers overwhelming. In the chaos, Seraphine's voice reached him, a whisper that cut through the noise. "Ryland, don't. They'll kill you." He turned to her, their eyes meeting for a fleeting moment. In that glance, he saw her fear, her longing, and something deeper, a trust that he would not let be broken. With a roar, he charged at Morgrath, their blades clashing in a shower of sparks. The fight was brutal, each strike a test of will and strength. But Ryland's resolve was unshakable. He fought not just for Seraphine, but for the part of himself she had awakened. Finally, with a powerful swing, he disarmed Morgrath, sending the pirate sprawling to the deck. "Let her go," Ryland growled, his voice low and dangerous. Morgrath sneered, but there was a flicker of fear in his eyes. "You think this changes anything? The sea is vast, Graves. You can't protect her forever." Ryland didn't respond. He cut through the nets, freeing Seraphine. She collapsed into his arms, her body trembling, but her spirit unbroken. "You came for me," she whispered, her voice filled with wonder. "Always," Ryland replied, his voice rough with emotion. As they escaped the crimson cutlass, the sea seemed to calm, as if acknowledging their victory. But the cost was high. Seraphine's strength was fading, her scales losing their luster. The trials were taking their toll, and Ryland knew they couldn't afford another misstep. That night, as the stars painted the sky, Ryland sat beside Seraphine on the deck of the skiff. Her head rested on his shoulder, her breathing soft and steady. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for not giving up on me." Ryland looked at her, his heart aching with a feeling he couldn't name. "You're worth fighting for," he said simply. In the silence that followed, the sea whispered its secrets, and for a moment, the world felt whole. The sea was a mirror of the sky, its surface shimmering with the reflection of 1,000 stars. Ryland and Seraphine sailed through the night, the skiff cutting through the waves like a blade through silk. The air was thick with the scent of salt and the faint, sweet aroma of blooming seaweed. Seraphine sat at the bow, her tail draped over the edge, the moonlight catching her scales and turning them into a cascade of silver and blue. Ryland watched her from the helm, his heart heavy with the weight of the trials. The second trial had tested their trust, but the third would test something far deeper: sacrifice. Seraphine had spoken of the heart of the ocean, a place where the sea's soul resided. It was there they would face the final trial, and Ryland could feel the gravity of it pressing down on him like the depths of the abyss. "Tell me about the heart," Ryland said, his voice breaking the silence. Seraphine turned to him, her eyes glowing softly in the moonlight. "It is a place of beauty and pain," she said, her voice like the whisper of the tide. "A place where the sea's heart beats, and where those who seek its secrets must offer something of their own." Ryland frowned, his grip tightening on the tiller. "What kind of sacrifice?" Seraphine's gaze softened, and she swam closer, her hand resting on the edge of the skiff. "The sea does not ask for what is easy to give," she said. "It asks for what matters most." Ryland's chest tightened, but he nodded. He had already lost so much, but the thought of losing Seraphine was unbearable. As dawn broke, they reached the heart of the ocean. It was a hidden grotto, its entrance concealed by a curtain of cascading water. Inside, the air was cool and filled with the sound of dripping water and the faint hum of the sea's pulse. The walls glowed with bioluminescent algae, casting an ethereal light that danced across the water. At the center of the grotto stood a pedestal of coral, atop which rested a shimmering orb, the sea's heart. It pulsed with a soft, rhythmic light, as if alive. Seraphine swam to the pedestal, her movements graceful but tinged with sadness. "This is where the trial begins," she said, her voice echoing in the cavern. Ryland stepped forward, his boots splashing in the shallow water. "What do I need to do?" Seraphine turned to him, her eyes filled with a mixture of love and sorrow. "You must offer something that holds great meaning to you," she said. "Something that represents your connection to the sea, to yourself, and to me." Ryland's breath caught. He knew what he had to do. Without hesitation, he removed the Ebon Marauder's compass from his belt. It was more than a tool. It was a symbol of his life as a pirate, of the freedom he had always sought. He placed it on the pedestal, his hand trembling slightly. The sea's heart pulsed brighter, its light enveloping the compass. For a moment, the grotto was filled with a blinding radiance, and then the compass was gone, absorbed into the orb. Seraphine's eyes widened, and she swam to him, her hand reaching for his. "Ryland," she whispered, her voice filled with awe. "You gave up your compass, your freedom." Ryland shook his head, his gaze steady. "Freedom isn't in a compass," he said. "It's in the choices we make, and I choose you." Seraphine's breath hitched, and for a moment, the world seemed to stand still. Then she leaned forward, her forehead resting against his. "You are more than I ever dreamed," she said softly. The grotto seemed to sigh, the water rippling with approval. The trial was complete, but the cost was heavy. Ryland felt the loss of the compass like a physical ache, but it was overshadowed by the warmth of Seraphine's hand in his. As they left the grotto, the sea seemed to sing, its waves carrying a melody that spoke of love, sacrifice, and the eternal bond between land and sea. Ryland and Seraphine sailed into the dawn, their hearts intertwined like the currents of the ocean. The sea was restless, its waves rising and falling like the breath of a slumbering giant. Ryland and Seraphine sailed under a sky heavy with storm clouds, the air thick with the promise of rain. The trials had brought them closer, but the cost weighed heavily on both. Seraphine's strength was fading, her once vibrant scales now dulled, and Ryland's heart ached with the knowledge that time was running out. They were nearing the Leviathan's Maw, a whirlpool said to be the gateway to the Abyssal Crown, the artifact that could save Seraphine. But the Maw was guarded by the Kraken, the very beast that had taken Ryland's crew and haunted his dreams. As the skiff approached the swirling vortex, the water grew darker, the waves more violent. Seraphine gripped the edge of the boat, her knuckles white. "Ryland," she said, her voice trembling, "this is where we part ways. The Kraken will not let us pass." Ryland's jaw tightened, his green eyes blazing with determination. "I'm not leaving you," he said firmly. "Not now. Not ever." Seraphine's eyes filled with tears, but she nodded. Together, they prepared for the battle ahead. Ryland armed himself with the harpoon forged from Seraphine's enchanted scales, its tip glowing faintly in the dim light. Seraphine, though weakened, summoned the last of her strength, her voice rising in a haunting melody that seemed to calm the storm. The whirlpool roared to life, its waters churning with fury. From its depths emerged the Kraken, its massive tentacles thrashing, its eyes glowing with a malevolent light. Ryland stood at the bow, his heart pounding, but his resolve unshaken. "Stay behind me," he said to Seraphine, his voice steady. But she shook her head, swimming to the side. "We face this together," she said, her voice filled with a quiet strength. The Kraken attacked, its tentacles slamming into the skiff with bone-rattling force. Ryland fought with everything he had, his harpoon striking true as he dodged the creature's blows. Seraphine's song grew louder, her voice weaving through the chaos like a thread of light. But the Kraken was relentless. One of its tentacles wrapped around Seraphine, lifting her into the air. Ryland's heart stopped as he saw her struggle, her tail flicking weakly. "No," he shouted, leaping onto the Kraken's massive body. He climbed with desperate determination, his harpoon glowing brighter with each step. When he reached the creature's head, he plunged the harpoon into its eye, the enchanted tip piercing deep. The kraken roared, its grip on Seraphine loosening. She fell into the water, her body limp. Rylan jumped after her, pulling her to the surface as the kraken sank beneath the waves, its body dissolving into the depths. Seraphine, Rylan whispered, cradling her in his arms. Her eyes fluttered open, but her strength was nearly gone. You did it, she said softly, her voice barely audible. You faced your greatest fear, for me. Rylan's throat tightened, his vision blurring with tears. I told you, he said, his voice breaking. You're worth fighting for. Seraphine smiled, her hand reaching up to touch his face. You've given me more than I ever dreamed, she said. But the trials, they've taken too much. I don't have much time left. Rylan shook his head, his grip on her tightening. No, I won't lose you. Not like this. Seraphine's eyes softened, and she leaned closer, her lips brushing his in a kiss that was as fleeting as a wave upon the shore. It was a kiss filled with love, with gratitude, and with the unspoken promise of what could have been. As the storm began to clear, Seraphine's body began to dissolve, her form turning into sea foam that sparkled like diamonds in the sunlight. Rylan held her as long as he could, his heart breaking as she slipped through his fingers. When she was gone, the sea fell silent, as if mourning her loss. Rylan sat alone in the skiff, the weight of her absence pressing down on him like the depths of the ocean. But as he looked out at the horizon, he saw a single star appear in the sky, its light bright and unwavering. It was a reminder that Seraphine's spirit lived on, not just in the sea, but in him. The sea was calm now, its surface smooth as glass, reflecting the pale light of the moon. Rylan sat alone in the skiff, his hands gripping the sides as if they were the only things keeping him anchored to the world. The air was heavy with the scent of salt and the faint, lingering sweetness of Seraphine's presence. He stared at the spot where she had vanished, his heart a hollow echo in his chest. Around him, the water shimmered with tiny specks of light, like stars fallen from the sky. They swirled and danced, forming patterns that seemed almost deliberate. Rylan reached out, his fingers brushing the surface, and for a moment he felt her warmth, her laughter, the way her eyes had softened when she looked at him. Seraphine, he whispered, his voice breaking. The lights grew brighter, coalescing into a faint, glowing figure. It was her, but not her, a shimmering silhouette of the mermaid he had come to love. Her form was translucent, her scales catching the moonlight and scattering it like diamonds. She hovered above the water, her eyes filled with a quiet sadness. You did it, Rylan, she said, her voice a gentle echo. You faced the trials. You proved your worth. Rylan shook his head, his throat tight. It doesn't matter. Not without you. Seraphine's form shimmered, her hand reaching out to brush his cheek. Though he couldn't feel her touch, the gesture filled him with a warmth that eased the ache in his chest. You gave me something I thought I'd never have, she said softly. A chance to be loved, to be seen. And in return, I gave you a piece of the sea's heart. Rylan's eyes burned with unshed tears. I don't want the sea's heart. I want you. Seraphine smiled, her expression filled with a love that transcended words. I will always be with you, she said. In the waves, in the stars, in the songs the sea sings. Look for me, and you will find me. As she spoke, her form began to dissolve, the lights scattering like fireflies on the wind. Rylan reached out, desperate to hold her, but she slipped through his fingers like water. Wait, he pleaded, his voice raw with emotion. Don't go. But she was already fading, her voice a whisper on the breeze. Goodbye, Rylan Graves. Until the tides bring us together again. And then she was gone, the lights fading into the night. Rylan sat alone, the weight of her absence pressing down on him like the depths of the ocean. But as he looked up at the sky, he saw a new constellation forming, a cluster of stars that resembled a mermaid, her tail curving gracefully across the heavens. It was her, Seraphine. The sea seemed to sigh, its waves lapping gently against the skiff as if in consolation. Rylan took a deep breath, the salt air filling his lungs. He knew he couldn't stay here, lost in his grief. Seraphine had given him a purpose, a reason to keep going. With a heavy heart, he picked up the oars and began to row, the skiff cutting through the water with a quiet determination, The stars above guided him, their light a reminder that Seraphine's spirit lived on, not just in the sea, but in him. As dawn broke, painting the sky in hues of pink and gold, Ryland reached the shores of Havemore. The port was alive with the sounds of sailors and merchants, but he felt detached, as if he were watching the world from a distance. He stepped onto the dock, his boots echoing against the wood. The people around him stared, their whispers carrying on the wind. They had heard the stories, the legends of the pirate captain and the mermaid, but Ryland paid them no mind. He had a new mission now, to protect the sea, to honor Seraphine's memory. And perhaps, in doing so, he would find peace. Years had passed since Ryland Graves last saw Seraphine, but her presence lingered in every wave, every gust of wind, every star that dotted the night sky. He had become a legend, known as the captain of the lost tides, a protector of the seas who sailed with a quiet determination and a heart heavy with memory. His ship, the Ebon Marauder, had been rebuilt, its black sails a symbol of resilience and hope. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, Ryland stood at the helm, his eyes fixed on the horizon. The sea was calm, its surface reflecting the fading light like a mirror, but beneath its tranquil surface, he knew, lay mysteries and dangers that few could comprehend. A soft splash broke the silence, drawing Ryland's attention. He turned, his hand instinctively going to the hilt of his cutlass, but what he saw made his breath catch. A young mermaid emerged from the water, her scales shimmering in the twilight. Her hair was a cascade of silver, and her eyes, a deep, mesmerizing blue, were unmistakably familiar. She swam closer, her movements graceful and deliberate, until she was just below the ship's railing. "Captain Ryland Graves," she said, her voice soft but steady. "I've been searching for you." Ryland's heart pounded as he leaned over the railing, his eyes searching hers. "Who are you?" he asked, though deep down he already knew. "My name is Immerse," she replied. "I was told you knew my mother." The words struck Ryland like a wave, knocking the air from his lungs. He stared at her, his mind racing. "Seraphine," he whispered, the name heavy with emotion. Immerse nodded, her expression softening. "She spoke of you often. She said you were the bravest man she ever knew." Ryland's throat tightened, and he looked away, his gaze falling to the water. "She was the bravest person I ever knew," he said quietly. For a moment, there was only the sound of the waves lapping against the ship. Then Immerse spoke again, her voice filled with a quiet urgency. "The sea is in danger, Captain. The abyssal crown has been found, and those who seek it do not understand its power. If it falls into the wrong hands, it could destroy everything." Ryland's jaw tightened, his old instincts flaring to life. "Where is it?" "In the Coral Citadel," Immerse replied. "But the path is treacherous and the trials have changed. I need your help." Ryland looked at her, seeing so much of Seraphine in her eyes. He nodded, his resolve hardening. "I'll help you," he said. "For her." As night fell, Ryland and Immerse set sail for the Coral Citadel. The journey was filled with stories, of Seraphine, of the trials, of the love that had bound Ryland to the sea. Immerse listened intently, her eyes shining with a mixture of awe and sorrow. "She loved you," Immerse said one night, her voice barely above a whisper. "Even in her final moments she thought of you." Ryland's chest ached, but he managed a small smile. "And I loved her, more than anything." As they neared the Coral Citadel, the sea grew restless, its waves rising and falling like the breath of a slumbering giant. The air was thick with the scent of salt and the faint, sweet aroma of blooming seaweed. Immerse turned to Ryland, her expression filled with determination. "This is where we face the trials," she said. "But this time we face them together." Ryland nodded, his heart swelling with a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. "Together," he agreed. As they approached the citadel, the water began to glow, its light casting an ethereal radiance over the ship. Ryland stood at the bow, his eyes fixed on the horizon. He didn't know what lay ahead, but he knew one thing for certain. Seraphine's legacy would live on, not just in Immerse, but in him. And as the stars began to appear in the sky, their light forming the familiar shape of a mermaid, Rylan felt a sense of peace. Seraphine was with him, in the waves, in the stars, in the heart of the sea. The coral citadel rose from the depths like a forgotten dream, its spires glowing with an otherworldly light. The water around it shimmered, alive with bioluminescent creatures that danced like fireflies in the dark. Rylan stood at the bow of the Ebon Marauder, his eyes fixed on the ancient structure. Beside him, Maris floated in the water, her silver hair catching the light and her tail flicking gently to keep her in place. "This is it," Maris said, her voice soft but steady. "The final trial." Rylan nodded, his heart pounding with a mixture of anticipation and dread. He had faced the trials once before, and the memories of Seraphine's sacrifice still haunted him. But this time was different. This time, he wasn't alone. Together, they approached the citadel, the water growing warmer as they neared its entrance. The air was thick with the scent of salt and the faint, sweet aroma of blooming coral. Inside, the walls glowed with a soft, pulsating light, and the sound of dripping water echoed like a heartbeat. At the center of the citadel stood the abyssal crown, resting on a pedestal of coral. It was a thing of beauty and terror, its surface etched with ancient runes that seemed to shift and change as Rylan approached. "The crown holds the power of the sea," Maris said, her voice filled with awe. "But it also holds its pain. To wield it, you must understand both." Rylan hesitated, his hand hovering over the crown. He thought of Seraphine, of the love they had shared and the sacrifices they had made. He thought of Maris, of the legacy she carried and the future she represented. "Take it," Maris urged, her eyes filled with determination. "For her, for us." Rylan's fingers closed around the crown, and the world seemed to shift. Visions flooded his mind, of storms and calm seas, of love and loss, of life and death. He saw Seraphine, her smile radiant, her eyes filled with a love that transcended time. He felt her presence, warm and comforting, like the sun on his skin. When the visions faded, Rylan stood tall, the crown in his hands. He turned to Maris, his heart swelling with a sense of purpose. "We'll protect the sea," he said, "together." Maris nodded, her eyes shining with pride. "Together." As they left the citadel, the sea seemed to sing, its waves carrying a melody that spoke of love, sacrifice, and the eternal bond between land and sea. Rylan and Maris sailed into the dawn, their hearts intertwined like the currents of the ocean. Years passed, and the legend of the captain of the Lost Tides grew. Rylan and Maris became protectors of the sea, their bond unbreakable. They faced storms and battles, but they also found moments of peace, of quiet nights under the stars, of laughter and shared stories. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Rylan stood at the helm, his eyes fixed on the horizon. Maris swam alongside the ship, her silver hair catching the light. "Do you think she's watching us?" Maris asked, her voice soft. Rylan smiled, his gaze falling to the water. "Always," he said. "In the waves, in the stars, in the songs the sea sings." As the stars began to appear in the sky, their light forming the familiar shape of a mermaid, Rylan felt a sense of peace. Seraphine was with him, in the waves, in the stars, in the heart of the sea. And as the Ebon Marauder sailed into the night, its black sails a symbol of resilience and hope, Rylan knew that their story would live on. A tale of love, sacrifice, and the eternal tide.